increases the net cost because you will continue having the administrative costs that otherwise would be no longer in effect as a result of the underlying bill. And therefore, the point of order would still be appropriate.
Any other member wish to be heard on the point of order? The Chair is prepared to rule. The gentleman from Illinois makes a point of order that the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado violates Clause 10 of Rule 21 by proposing an increase in mandatory spending over a relevant period of time. Pursuant to Clause 10 of Rule 21 and Clause 4 of Rule 29, the Chair is authoritatively guided by estimates from the Chair of the Committee on the Budget that the net effect of the provisions in the amendment would increase mandatory spending over a relevant period as compared to the bill. Accordingly, the point of order is sustained and the amendment is not in order. Are there further amendments to the bill? Then the unfinished business, pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on the amendment on which further proceedings were postponed. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Peters, on which further proceedings were postponed and in which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by Mr. Peters of Michigan.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.
First vote underway as the House is trying to wrap up legislative business for the day with this round of votes. Members have been working on a bill that ends taxpayer financing of presidential election campaigns and party conventions. When the chamber gavels out later today, members won't return until Tuesday, February 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern. This is a vote on an amendment to this bill, and it will begin the series of votes. Some other programming to tell you about today on the C-SPAN networks. We'll bring you testimony from the co-chairs of the President's Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf Coast. The final report was released earlier this month and calls for sweeping changes in how the oil and gas industry operates and the government regulators who monitor that industry. You can see the hearing. It's being held by the House Natural Resources Committee. That's today, 2 p.m. Eastern, and we'll have that for you on C-SPAN 3. The Senate's also in session. Today, members are working on a resolution that honors the Tucson victims and first responders, with a vote scheduled for about 2:30 p.m. Eastern. And negotiations continue off the floor on amending the Senate filibuster rule. Live coverage of the Senate is on C-SPAN 2. So while this 15-minute vote continues, we will show you some floor debate from earlier today on this measure, looking at election financing.
Campaigns decided by how much secret money flows into an election from secret outside groups. And they will no longer tolerate, I believe, those politicians turning around and saying to those citizens, you have no right to know who's paying for what in our political campaigns. You have no right to know who is paying for those TV advertisements that you're watching. Let's remember what we're talking about here. The current presidential financing system that this bill would eliminate arose from public outrage in the post-Watergate period. Rather than presidential candidates trafficking in secret slush funds, our nation decided that our democracy would be better served by a system of public disclosure, contribution limits, and emphasis on smaller dollar contributions matched by the Presidential Financing Fund. The system is voluntary, one line on your tax code, not complicated, and while not perfect, for most of its 36 years in existence, it has served this nation well. Candidates from across the political spectrum, from Ronald Reagan to Jesse Jackson, have voluntarily participated in the presidential financing system. Now, as a colleague on the other side of the aisle mentioned, there is no doubt that the current law needs to be modernized. It needs to be fixed. We saw that in the last presidential election, but rather than throw out something that has served the country and the electorate well for 36 years, rather than throw it out, Let's fix it. And Mr. Price from North Carolina and I and others have introduced legislation to do exactly that. So rather than shielding an avalanche of unlimited special interest money from public view, we should shine a light on it. We should do it by modernizing the presidential system, and we should also pass the Disclose Act, which we could have brought up and voted on, except for the previous question was just defeated. Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, our nation's democracy doesn't belong to presidents or members of Congress. It belongs to the voters who send us here, and we have a solemn responsibility to safeguard it on their behalf and protect it for future generations from the lessons and corruption of history. Let's mend it. Let's fix it. Let's not throw it out. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman's time's expired. The committee will rise informally for the purposes of receiving a message. Will the gentleman from Nebraska kindly take the chair?
The House will be in order and the Chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has agreed with ESCOM Res. 3, honoring the service and sacrifice of Staff Sergeant Salvatore Junta, a native of Hiawatha, Iowa, and the first living recipient of the Medal of Honor since the Vietnam War, in which the concurrence of the House is requested.
The committee will resume its sitting.
The chair sees the gentleman from Illinois on his feet. Is it the intention of the House Administration Committee to let Ways and Means conclude their half an hour before you yield time, or are we going to go?
You want to just...
It'd be the chair's inclination to represent the gentleman from California at this moment in time if you're going to do it all at the same time. But gentleman from California, Mr. Lundgren.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. If it hasn't been requested already, I would ask that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Well, it's already been requested in the House, and we can move on.
Mr. Chair, I rise today in support of H.R. 359, which terminates the taxpayer financing of presidential election campaigns and party conventions. At the outset, I just want to mention, in response to something that was said by the other side, this has absolutely nothing to do with the Citizens United case decided by the Supreme Court. That changed not one iota campaign finance law. Corporations still cannot make contributions to campaigns or candidates. It does not change that. Citizens United had to do with the question of whether or not one loses his or her First Amendment protections of free speech, particularly with respect to expressions of political nature, merely because they associate with another person. The Supreme Court told us that you do not, in fact, lose your First Amendment rights because you happen to say it jointly with someone else. As a matter of fact, they pointed out that some people with the least amount of influence in a society actually expand their influence in the political debate by joining with others. And then the question of the Supreme Court that the Supreme Court answered was that if that association happens to be corporate in nature, happens to be a union, happens to be a for-profit, happens to be a not-for-profit, whether that changes the dynamic as contemplated by the First Amendment protections, and they told us it did not. So let's get rid of that canard here on the floor right away. This has absolutely nothing to do with that. This has absolutely nothing to do with corporate contributions to campaigns or foreign contributions to campaigns, both of which remain illegal with criminal sanctions under the law. So let's get that out of the way to begin with so we don't have a lot of debate here that has nothing to do with the bill before us. Mr. Chairman, we find ourselves at a unique juncture in the long-standing debate over this issue, but frankly, in reality, it is a juncture no longer. Taxpayer financing of presidential elections and party conventions, the 2 major parties, is simply no longer defensible. The first tax liability contributions from American taxpayers to be diverted towards the funding of presidential elections began 35 years ago in 1976. This new practice was, as we were told by the other side, supposed to raise the public's trust in the government, as well as to increase both the number of candidates and thus electoral competition and the financial footing between parties. I believe, Mr. Chairman, it has failed on all accounts. It did allow us to have Lyndon LaRouche be a participant in the presidential elections. I'm not sure when we've had someone who had been subjected to a criminal conviction and actually conducted part of his campaign while still incarcerated. But that was brought to us by way of this fine law. In 1976, approximately $1.5 billion, since 1976, approximately $1.5 billion has been spent on this system. As we speak, there is a balance of $195 million sitting in the Presidential Election Campaign Fund at the U.S. Treasury Department. And yet, this system of electoral subsidization has not changed the public's perception of our presidential elections or our politics. According to one survey after another, Americans continue to harbor deep distrust of their elected officials. So does anyone think that our presidential elections over the past 35 years have shown a virtuous progression towards more accuracy and more honesty? Mr. Chairman, prominent presidential candidates who even supposedly believe in this system, have opted out of this taxpayer financing scheme in recent years. In 2004 and 2008, several candidates declined public financing for their primary campaigns. And as was mentioned by the gentleman from Illinois, during the most recent presidential election, for the first time, the nominee of one of our two major political parties withdrew from the public financing during the general election and instead went on to raise record amounts of money for his campaign. And I recall when I thought we heard a pledge to participate in this program because of the virtuous nature of the program. Somehow that was lost along the campaign trail. In addition to presidential primaries, and one of the things I would like to point out is this. There is this idea that somehow we are going to be able to suppress money that goes into politics. The fact of the matter is it's like a balloon, a water balloon. If you squeeze it on one side, it comes out on the other side. The question is, how do we get it within the system? We should be talking about the idea of this silly demarcation between our parties and our candidates, where we limit in extreme fashion the amount of money that can be transferred or coordinated, as if somehow that corrupts the candidate to have him or her identified with the very party they represent. We ought to be working towards those kinds of changes that will allow a greater responsibility on the party and the candidates to express their positions and to hold to their positions, be responsible for their positions. But no, we talk about these ways of how we're going to somehow reduce the impact of money in campaigns. It hasn't worked under this system. It hasn't worked. In addition to presidential primaries and general elections, if there's anything the American taxpayer should not be subsidizing, I would say, as much as I enjoy them, the week-long presidential conventions. On our side of the aisle, in our party, I think we've had some indications of what I consider to be wasteful spending in preparation for our upcoming convention. And to say to the taxpayer that in light of that, we ought to continue to subsidize the production of our presidential conventions by the two major parties is very difficult to articulate and even to understand. They are, as I say, grand fun, wonderful occasions, week-long party gatherings that are, unfortunately, in this day and age, largely symbolic. One can't even argue something important is being decided because, unfortunately, they ceased to have real significance some time ago. And that was part of our effort to try and cleanse the system. Rather than having people selected by these delegates that come to these conventions, we should move more and more to the primary operation. And, of course, then earlier and earlier in the season, so that somehow it becomes a two-year event. Well, I guess we're already in that. Well, taxpayers would be shocked, if not outraged, to discover that they have been funding these extravagant photo ops. Mr. Chair, as I mentioned, since 1976, approximately $1.5 billion has been spent on publicly funding our presidential primaries, our presidential general elections, and our presidential party conventions. The American taxpayer has paid enough for this unwise experiment. I think it should be ended, and the balance of the Presidential Election Campaign Fund and the Presidential Primary Matching Payment Account returned to the Treasury to be used for deficit reduction. I think we'd actually have the American people cheer us for that. According to the 2010 Congressional Budget Office estimate, the elimination of this program would save American taxpayers $617 million over the next 10 years. Now, some could say, well, that's your opinion, we have our opinion, why change things? Well, why don't we look to the opinion of the American people? Not a bad idea in this House. Simply put, this program does not have the support of the American people. Taxpayer support has declined precipitously over time. I remember years ago, I thought it was a good experiment. I thought it was a good idea. I checked off some of my taxes to go to this program. I was in hopes that it would actually prove to be a good change. I, like most Americans, though, who contributed to that in the past, have given up on the program. We don't believe it gave us what we thought it might. In 1980, for instance, the percentage of taxpayers participating through their tax form checkoff was 28.7%. It was so popular that in 1985 it was 23%. It proved so successful that in 1990 it was 19.5%. Boy, it really proved itself by the year 95, because then 12.9% of the American taxpayer decided they'd participate. In the year 2000, it dropped to 11.5%. In 2005, it was 9.1%. And according to the IRS data obtained from the FEC, the checkoff rate in 2010 was 7.3%. In other words, on a direct vote, a plebiscite taken by the taxpayers of America, 92.7% reject the notion. Now, where I come from, that's a landslide. I think even in Chicago it would be a landslide, even if you paid your taxes only once. Mr. Chairman, this candidate in convention subsidy is obviously unpopular. To paraphrase one former member of the Federal Election Commission, quote, any system of public financing must have popular support to succeed. Today's low taxpayer checkoff rates cast serious doubt on whether the public financing system has this support. When only 1 in 13 taxpayers are participating, it's very difficult to conclude that the public financing system has broad popular support. Mr. Chairman, as we promised in the Pledge to America, and as we promised here on the floor during these initial weeks of the 112th Congress, and as we have verified by our Transparency Enhancing Rules package, our bipartisan votes to trim Congress's budget and end excessive congressional printing, by our determination to return discretionary spending to fiscal year 2008 levels or less, and now through this bill, the Republican majority is committed to fiscal stewardship, to having a relentless eye on waste and inefficiency, and have continued commitment through this 112th Congress to reduce spending, to create private sector jobs, and produce meaningful legislation that makes long-lasting reforms. Mr. Chairman, if we in fact mean what we say when we say we are willing to look at those programs that already exist and to judge whether or not they have proven to be efficacious or efficient or successful in promoting the principles that underlaid their passage in the first place, we ought to start with this. This is a program that almost 93% of the American people who pay taxes reject. And we're asking them to participate. Maybe we ought to listen to what they are saying and instead allow the savings garnered by this particular bill to go towards deficit reduction. This bill, introduced by our colleague from Oklahoma, should garner overwhelming bipartisan support. We should thank him for introducing it, and I do, and for his commitment to a more responsible and efficient stewardship of taxpayer dollars. I would urge my colleagues to understand what this bill is and understand what it is not, and support H.R. 359. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. Before recognizing the gentleman from Pennsylvania, it was the Chair's understanding that perhaps the gentleman from Washington would like to consume some of the Ways and Means time and then ask permission to give the rest of his time to the gentleman from Pennsylvania. If that understanding is correct, the Chair would recognize the gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield to the gentleman, the Chairman of the Oversight Committee, or the ranking member of the Oversight Committee, for which time as he may wish to use in answering Mr. Lundgren.
Well, the gentleman has his own time. Do you want him to use yours? Which one do you want to do? You want him to use your time or your time? Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized in his own time.
Thank you. It's my pleasure now to yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from California, distinguished member of the Committee on House Administration, Ms. Lupton.
Gentlelady from California for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to H.R. 359. This bill will unnecessarily eliminate the voluntary $3 checkoff box. It's voluntary on tax returns to fund presidential elections and could increase the influence of special interests in the funding of presidential campaigns. Now, the bill has been fast-tracked by the Republican leadership without any hearings, no markups, no respect for the committee process. As a member of the House Administration Committee and a former chair of the Subcommittee on Elections, I'm very concerned by the end run around our committee and the lack of deference shown to the committee and its members. Speaker Boehner promised 2 weeks ago, when he took the Speaker's gavel, more transparency in the legislative process and to focus on job creation. Last week, the new majority fast-tracked the health care reform repeal bill. This week, they expedite the repeal of this voluntary program without the proper process. So I think the Speaker may need to revisit his statement about process and transparency. In addition to the process concerns, I question the need for Congress to pass this bill at all. I was here as a young staffer when the Judiciary Committee took up the impeachment of President Nixon. And it's worth remembering that the public finance system was created as a direct result of the Watergate scandal. Remember Phillips Petroleum, that illegally contributed $498,000 to the Nixon campaign, or Ruth Farkas, who told the Watergate grand jury that she gave $300,000 to the Nixon campaign as an explicit exchange for an ambassadorship to Luxembourg, or the tapes, the Nixon tapes, that revealed Secretary John Connally shook down dairy farmers for $600,000 in contribution in exchange for raising milk price supports to the detriment of children who needed milk around the country. These incidents eroded public confidence not only in the Nixon administration, but in the entire system. And in response, pursuant to the General Welfare Clause of the U.S. Constitution, Congress passed sweeping election reforms, including the presidential checkoff system. Now, I would not argue that this system is perfect at this time. I think it does need reform. But I think mere elimination without a committee process is a huge mistake. I would hope that the committee could convene, that we could sort through what are the problems with this current system, how do we fix them, work in a bipartisan way to create the fixes, and then come to this House for the solution. I yield back and urge opposition to this bill.
Vote, the yeas are 396, the nays are 7. The amendment is agreed to. There being no further amendments authorized under the rule, the committee rises.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union has had under consideration H.R. 359, and pursuant to House Resolution 54, I report the bill back to the House with an amendment adopted in the Committee of the Whole.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration the bill H.R. 359 and, pursuant to House Resolution 54, reports the bill back to the House with an amendment adopted in the Committee of the Whole. Under the rule, the previous question is ordered. The question is on adoption of the amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill to reduce federal spending and the deficit by terminating taxpayer financing of presidential election campaigns and party conventions.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota rise?
Mr. Speaker, I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
Is the gentleman opposed to the bill?
I am.
The gentleman qualifies. The clerk will report the motion.
Mr. Walz of Minnesota moves to recommit the bill H.R. 359 to the Committee on Ways and Means with instructions to report the same to the House forthwith with the following amendment. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following. Section 1, Campaign Disclosure Agreement. A, Disqualified Entity. Section 9003 of the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 is amended by adding at the end the following new subsection. F, Disqualified Entity. For purposes of this section, 1, in general, the term disqualified entity means any entity that has not entered into a campaign disclosure agreement with the Department of the Treasury. 2, Campaign Disclosure Agreement.
Speaker, I ask suspension of the reading.
Objection.
Please cease all discussions. Is there objection to dispensing with the reading?
Yes.
Objection is heard. Continue reading.
The term Campaign Disclosure Agreement means an agreement in which the entity agrees, A, to file disclosure statements with the Internal Revenue Service at such times and covering such periods as are required under Section 527J2, B, with respect to its receipt of payment for electioneering communications from covered persons on or after January 1st, 2013, to include within those disclosure statements 1, the amount, date, and purpose of each payment and the name and address of the covered person making the payment, and 2, the name and address of each disqualified contributor making a payment on or after January 1st, 2013 to the covered person, including the occupation and name of employer of such individual, and the amount and date of each payment, and C, to pay damages to the Secretary for failure to comply with these disclosure requirements in an amount equal to 35% of the amount that was required to be disclosed. 3, disqualified contributor. The term disqualified contributor means A, any person who makes payments, directly or indirectly, of more than $100,000 to the covered person during the calendar year, and B, any foreign individual, foreign corporation, or foreign country who makes any payment directly or indirectly to the covered person during the calendar year. A payment that is deposited into the account of a covered person that is not available for electioneering communications shall not be taken into account for purposes of the preceding sentence. 4, electioneering communication. The term electioneering communication means a communication that A, refers to a clearly identified candidate for any federal public office.
I ask unanimous
B,
consent.
reflects
For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois rise?
To ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading.
Is there objection? Hearing none, so ordered. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois rise? No?
Reserve a point of order. We do.
All right. The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 5 minutes. Order. The House is not in order. Please cease conversations. Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 2.5 minutes to a true champion of transparency and openness in government and our elections, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman may yield, but not specific blocks of time. The gentleman.
I yield to Mr. Van Hollen.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague and thank him for offering this motion, because it's very simple. What this does is allow the American public to finally know who is funding the political ads that they're watching, financed by a lot of these shadowy groups. Mr. Speaker, if I could have some order, please.
The gentleman is correct. The House is not in order. Please cease all conversations. Please cease all conversations. Remove them to the cloakroom. Gentleman may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier today, our Republican colleagues rejected the idea of having broad transparency by adopting the Disclose Act. What this does is target it in one very important area, an area that the American public deserves to know, and that is when commercials, TV commercials, are paid for by special interests, big money special interests, including foreign corporations and corporations that are owned or controlled by foreign governments, whether they be China, Iran, Venezuela, whoever it may be, that the American public has a right to know who is paying for those ads. It's simple, it's transparent, and in fact, Mr. Speaker, if I could have some order, please.
Gentleman is correct. The House is not in order. Please refrain from noise on the House floor. Please remove your conversations from the floor. Gentleman may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, our Republican colleagues even recently said they were in favor of more transparency. Speaker Boehner said on Meet the Press, and I quote, "I think what we ought to do is we ought to have full disclosure of all the money that we raise and how it is spent. I think sunlight is the best disinfectant." I hope that would also be true about foreign-controlled corporations trying to secretly finance ads in this country. Majority Leader Cantor told Newsweek, and I quote, "Anything that moves us back toward the notion of transparency, real-time reporting of donations and contributions would be helpful toward restoring confidence of the voters." Mr. Speaker, this motion is very simple. Let's let the American public know when you have these big money special interests, including foreign-controlled corporations, spending this money to influence their vote. 80% of the American people, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, say they want to know. A vote against this motion is a vote to keep the American public in the dark, to continue allow those shadowy groups, including those controlled by foreign interests, to continue to try and influence the elections in this country without telling a single person. That's wrong. It violates the kind of pledge towards transparency and greater accountability that we heard a lot about in this last election. So I urge my colleagues to act on a bipartisan basis to simply give the public the right to know when those kind of organizations, including foreign-controlled corporations, are spending gobs of money on TV and not telling the American people who they are, who's financing it. Thank you, Speaker.
You bet. I thank the gentleman, and on the morning after the night we sat here together and listened to the President talking about us working together, we've got a motion to recommit that I think we can all agree upon. As the gentleman spoke about something very uniquely American in our election process is that humble idea of someone like myself, a school teacher, football coach, and soldier with no political connections and no personal wealth, can actually get their friends together and win elections to Congress. The idea that we should have our elections be influenced by undisclosed foreign money runs counter to everything in this nation's history. This piece of legislation was a bipartisan piece of legislation that was meant to curb the excesses in the post-Watergate era. It has been used by every president, including Ronald Reagan, to make sure that our election processes were fair. So we offer this motion to recommit in the spirit of last night's speech, something we can agree upon together, that foreign corporations should not buy our elections, that any American wishing to run for office should do so on merit and should do so with transparency and the knowledge of the American public. So I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, support this very simple motion to recommit, to keep our elections fair, to keep the American people informed, and to keep this democracy in our hands, not foreign corporations. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois rise?
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the motion.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The House is not in order.
Gentleman is correct. Please remove all conversations to the cloakroom or somewhere off the floor. Gentleman may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, there's really no sense of irony here, is there, that the proponents, the self-described proponents of transparency and openness, in the twinkling of an eye before a vote on an adjournment day, come over and say, there's your motion to recommit? This was posted online, Mr. Speaker, on Thursday of last week. The proponents, and this is a modified open rule, the proponents have an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, on Friday to file a motion, to file an amendment, on Monday to file an amendment, on Tuesday to file an amendment, but the very described people who are now cloaking themselves in a mantle of openness and transparency say, there you go, moments ago. Okay, that's the program. I get the program. What is this ultimately all about? There is a sincere effort on the part of this majority, and I think some folks on the minority as well, to take the President up. Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
House is not in order. Once again, please remove all conversations from the floor. Gentleman may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's a real attempt on the part of proponents of this bill, Mr. Cole of Oklahoma, to try and save money, to look out over the entire course of this budget and all of these challenges, and Mr. Cole and the folks that are behind H.R. 659, the underlying bill, are ultimately saying we can save $617 million over a 10-year period. Mr. Speaker, that's according to the CBO. So it comes down to a very simple thing. If you want to save the money, you defeat the amendment. If you want to play games on the day that we're all heading out, trying to act like you're full of transparency and openness, when
parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman from Illinois has the floor.
I urge a no vote, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back.
Can I ask? Parliamentary inquiry. Mr. Speaker, does the underlying bill...
Please state your parliamentary inquiry.
Does the underlying bill cut spending? Does the motion cut spending?
Answer that question.
Does a motion cut spending?
Parliamentary motion.
No further question.
All right. Without objection, with all time having been yielded back, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the motion to recommit. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. The noes have it.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Minnesota.
On that, I demand the yeas and nays.
The question, or the yeas and nays, are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, the Chair will reduce to 5 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote on the question of passage.
And so after a brief debate, the House trying to wrap up legislative business for the day with final votes. This is a 15-minute procedural vote on a bill that would end taxpayer financing of presidential election campaigns and party conventions. We expect a final vote to follow this procedural vote. And when the chamber gavels out later today, members won't return until Tuesday, February 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern. Coming up just a little bit later today on C-SPAN 3, testimony from the co-chairs of the President's Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf Coast. The final report was released earlier this month with calls for sweeping changes in how the oil and gas industry operates, as well as government regulators who monitor the industry. That's 2 p.m. on C-SPAN 3. Senate is also in session today, and members are working on a resolution that honors the Tucson victims and first responders, with a vote scheduled there 2:30 p.m. Eastern. This morning on Washington Journal, we had members of Congress react to the President's State of the Union speech last night. And while this vote is underway, we'd like to show you Senator Grassley, who talked about employment and tax issues. He is the Financial Committee ranking member in the Senate. Now, we'll show you this now while this vote's underway.
We'll go to Russell Rotunda up on Capitol Hill on the Senate side, where joining us up there is Senator Charles Grassley, Republican of Iowa and ranking member on the Finance Committee. And Senator Grassley, I want to begin where Mr. Van Hollen left off, and that's with what the President had to say on the issue of taxes, given your position on the Finance Committee. I want to show our viewers what the President said when it comes to lobbyists and the tax code, and get your reaction.
Over the years, a parade of lobbyists has rigged the tax code to benefit particular companies and industries. Those with accountants or lawyers to work the system can end up paying no taxes at all. But all the rest are hit with one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world. It makes no sense, and it has to change. So tonight I'm asking Democrats and Republicans to simplify the system, get rid of the loopholes, level the playing field, and use the savings to lower the corporate tax rate for the first time in 25 years without adding to our deficit.
Senator Grassley, what's your reaction to that?
I agree with the President. You know, there is an industry in this town of lobbyists and lawyers and accountants that, quite frankly, go to sophisticated ways to think up and even, can you believe it, copyright and patent certain tax principles. In fact, in a bill coming up that Senator Leahy and I've introduced, we want to do away with that patenting. But he's absolutely right. There's an industry, and then they come and sell it to Congress, and then you got an industry that benefits from it. But don't forget, you created an industry that thought this stuff up. Now, the President didn't say this, but he's calling for reducing the marginal tax rate on corporate taxes, because we're the second highest corporate tax rate all around the world, and that makes us very uncompetitive. And there is a principle of law that the President didn't express, a principle of taxation that says when you lower marginal tax rates, you broaden the tax base, and that's basically what the President is asking us to do. The only thing that I would disagree with the President on, if he's saying that to bring in more revenue, you should not be increasing taxes, particularly during a recession, but particularly if, you know, the old principle, you increase taxes, you get less of it. So if you want to increase employment, you don't increase taxes on the people that provide the jobs in America.
But the President is saying that the wealthiest Americans could sacrifice a little and take pay higher taxes in order to tackle the deficit, so that we can start to make a dent in that situation.
Well, now you're bringing up another item. What the President was speaking about there, what you quoted him, he was talking about the corporate tax rate. Now you're bringing up about the individual tax rate, and that's a legitimate point for you to bring up. And I think that we discuss that when we get out of the recession, because there is a principle that even the President agreed with in 2009, that when you're in a recession, you should not increase taxes. Because don't you remember, he ran in 2008 on a platform of increasing taxes on higher income people? But before he was sworn in 2 years ago right now, he announced, well, we're in a recession. You shouldn't increase taxes during a recession. Well, I would remind the President of what he said last night. The same principle applies. Let's talk about it after we get out of the recession, because you shouldn't increase taxes while you're in a recession.
Senator, we didn't hear a lot from the President about an overhaul of the tax code. What did you make of that?
Well, that's a continuation of the discussion you and I just had, and it follows along the lines. I think the President is taking off from what his own Debt Reduction Commission has suggested, and there you get into the same principle we talked about, the corporate tax code. We need to reduce the marginal tax rates on individuals. We need to have fewer brackets. We need to have lower brackets. And when you reduce tax rates, you can broaden the tax base. Now, just exactly which one of those you pick and choose, or do you do away with all of them, you know, that's going to have to be a point of discussion when you get down to the finite issues of just exactly what do you eliminate. But I can tell you there's a couple sensitive ones that are very difficult to deal with politically and economically. One of those deals with the charitable deduction for churches and nonprofit organizations and charitable organizations, and the other one is the home mortgage deduction.
All right, let's go to our callers here. Senator James is waiting to talk to you. He's on the Republican line in Sterling, Illinois. James, you with us?
Yep.
Go ahead, sir.
Senator Grassley, I was just wondering, what do you think about the President's comment last night about his reason that we need to improve education in the public schools?
Well, I'll tackle it from one point of spending money and another point that doesn't cost any money and is probably more important than anything that the President said. And in the last 2 years, he's said this at least 2 or 3 times, and I wish he would say it every day. He said the most important thing that we can do to further education is for parents to be more involved in the education of their kids. That education is important, that you know, book learning is more important than television, homework is more important than television. Parents ought to make sure that the teacher's work that they send home gets done, because the teachers aren't in the home, and that weekends are not something just for relaxation. If you look at how education is in Asia, and they're running away with us on a competitive thing, particularly in science and math, you'd find out that you do a lot of studying on weekends. And we don't seem to emphasize that in this country. And I feel strongly about what the President said. I agree with him, and I wish the President would just tell me how I can help him promote that, because I'd like to. Then the second issue involves money. And I think we have to look at different costs of money spent on education around the country, and it kind of tells you that money is not a total solution to the problem of education. Look at right here in Washington, D.C., where they spend maybe $13,000, $14,000 per student. And look at what they spend in Iowa, maybe $8,000 or $9,000 per student. And wouldn't you think that if you spend more money, you get better education, you're going to have better results in Washington, D.C. than you do Iowa? Well, no. The kids don't graduate from high school here. The ones that graduate, a lot of them are functionally illiterate, and you don't find that in Sterling, Illinois, or Cedar Falls, Iowa, as an example. So I think we have to look at how we're spending the money in education and not just throw more money at it.
Well, Senator, let's listen quickly to what the President had to say about race to the top in education.
Race to the top is the most meaningful reform of our public schools in a generation. For less than 1% of what we spend on education each year, it has led over 40 states to raise their standards for teaching and learning. And these standards were developed, by the way, not by Washington, but by Republican and Democratic governors throughout the country. And Race to the Top should be the approach we follow this year as we replace No Child Left Behind with a law that's more flexible and focused on what's best for our kids.
Your reaction to the State of the Union. We're talking with Senator Charles Grassley, Republican of Iowa, and ranking member on the Finance Committee. He's up at Russell Rotunda with us this morning. Baltimore, Maryland. Eric on the Independent line.
And I keep on hearing how President Obama has spent more than any other president and stuff, but we have to look back at the reality of things when he came into office in 2008. He basically came in trying to clean up the mess. Everybody don't want to admit it, but that Bush made. Now, he bailed out the banks. He gave tax cuts to the richest 1%. You look at Dow Jones now, they're almost at 12,000. They have money. They're not investing. They're hoarding their money. They're sending their businesses overseas. And to sit there and keep on perpetuating that Obama just spent this money crazily and this, that, I mean, I don't want to hear that. That's just rhetoric and politics.
All right, Senator, before you respond, let me read a tweet who echoes that caller, saying President Obama has created more private sector jobs than Bush did. Bush had net zero job growth in 8 years and left the nation in a great recession.
Well, those statistics in that tweet are wrong because it went from 37 million up to about 46 million, and it's back down to now about 38 or 39 million. So whoever said that Bush didn't create any jobs, they better go back and look at the statistics. And the caller from Maryland that just finished, I'd like to say that a lot of the stuff that he said I agree with, and all the fault does not rest with President Obama, but I think where President Obama gets hit legitimately is from the standpoint, and I'll quantify it, that the last 4 years have accumulated about the last 2 years has accumulated about almost $4 trillion of additional debt. Now that's just in 2 years compared to the $10 trillion that was accumulated over the previous 225 years. So, and that comes from the standpoint that a lot of the things that President Obama, maybe when he thought he ought to do them, like the stimulus bill and like increasing appropriations the last 2 years by 22%, which you can't keep up. I think he thought he was doing well, but it just did not work, and it did end up adding to a great deal to the deficit.
Here's an email, Senator, from a viewer, Joan in Randolph, Vermont, and she writes this. I noticed you said that we can't raise taxes during a recession. However, the Republicans don't want to raise taxes ever. You mentioned there's a theory that raising taxes during a recession is harmful to the economy. But there is also a theory that you don't cut spending during a recession. It seems the Republicans only want to look at one side of the equation.
Well, first of all, we would say that for a period of time, that yes, the government can spend to fill a vacuum when consumers aren't spending. And consumer spending really went down. So there was a legitimacy to that. But the point is that what's spent didn't really do what it was supposed to do, because you see, of that $814 billion that went into the stimulus package, you get to a point where only 1/2 of that went into small business, and small business creates 70% of the new jobs. So more of it should have been put into small business instead of public sector employment, because, you know, government consumes wealth. Government doesn't create wealth. And the other part of it was only about 3% of the $814 billion went into building roads and other infrastructure, and more should have gone into that, rather than just spending the way Congress traditionally spends. And then on the taxes that the person brought up in the Twitter, I would say this, that I would be willing and consider raising taxes if it went to the bottom line. In other words, a dollar raise went to a dollar reduction in the deficit. But there are several studies over the last 30, 40 years, maybe even 50 years, that show that when Congress increases taxes, it's a license to spend $1.15. Now that's the lowest figure. There's some that go up to $1.69. So I use the lowest figure of $1.15. Now that doesn't reduce the deficit by increasing taxes, that increases the deficit. And so what we have to do is make sure that the problem then is on the spending side, not on the taxing side. And that's kind of where we are. It's kind of like a dog chasing its tail. You never catch up.
Senator, on infrastructure spending and what the President had to say last night about making these types of investments, do you see middle ground there between Democrats and Republicans?
Yeah, I think so, and you're going to find that later this year in the transportation bill that comes up. And it should have come up 2 years ago, but because of the recession and you can't increase taxes during a recession, it's just been extended from the law 5 years ago. But I think we're going to get to a point where we're going to have a major debate on infrastructure this year.
All right, let's go to Nashville, Tennessee. Catherine is joining us on the Republican line.
Yes, ma'am. Good morning.
Morning.
I just wanted to ask...
are 173. The nays are 228. The motion is not adopted. The question is on passage of the bill. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. The ayes have it. First does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Nays.
The gentleman has requested the yeas and nays. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having arisen. The yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
And the House wrapping up its legislative business for the day with a final vote on a bill that would end taxpayer financing of presidential election campaigns and party conventions. When the chamber gavels out later today, members won't return until Tuesday, February 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern. The Senate in session today. You can watch that live on C-SPAN 2. And on C-SPAN 3, a hearing just getting underway of the House National Resources Committee on offshore oil and gas drilling with references to the BP Horizon disaster of last year. You're watching live coverage on C-SPAN. We'll look in on this 5-minute vote now.
yeas are 239. The nays are 160. The bill is passed, and without objection, a motion to reconsider is